tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. It is Monday, March 12th, and I guess you could call it Happy Bracket Day. If we had Nick Pitts in here, he'd give it some kind of day, but this is the day, at least, when many of you then are starting to fill out your brackets for the NCAA tournament, and so we'll certainly see productivity around the country probably drop a little bit, maybe take a dip as people are filling out their brackets. And then later in the week, you know what we will have as well, and that is a number of individuals in your office where you might be, or in your neighborhood, will actually have done better in the brackets than you did, and not because they understand anything about basketball, but because they liked one nickname better than the other. They liked one team better than the other. We'll see how this plays out. But that's all I'm going to say about that. But I do plan to spend a little bit of time talking about a special election taking place tomorrow. Now, in some respects, this should not even be significant because, after all, we are talking about a special election in Pennsylvania's 18th district. You might say, well, I don't live in Pennsylvania. Why should I care? Well, here's why. This is a district that very easily should have been a Republican gimme, if you will. And so tomorrow, and especially tomorrow night, if the Republican loses, I mean, you're going to see apocalyptic headlines everywhere. The end of the Republican Party as we know it. Donald Trump has drugged down the favorability of Republican candidates. Or even if this Republican candidate wins, that candidate, if only he wins by a few points, that still will be something we will see. If on Wednesday you look at the newspapers or pull up your websites and don't see anything about it, that means that the Republican run handily, and that was the end of that discussion. So we will see how that plays out. And one of the reasons I want to bring it up is because it gets back into the subject of abortion. And so two of our articles today will be in that topic, because we're going to be looking at, in particular, one of the things that's being said by the Democratic candidate right now, a very articulate, very good-looking young man who is Catholic and has had to, as most Democrats have had to do if they run for office, make some kind of compromise with his faith in order to be a Democrat. It is quite possible, as I said on this program before, to be a Republican and not be pro-life. Even though the Republican Party platform is pro-life, there is a big enough tent that you can come up with all sorts of individuals, maybe not so much in the primaries, but certainly in the general election, to be pro-choice or pro-abortion and be a Republican. It is becoming almost impossible to be a pro-life Democrat. So in order to be successful and to keep your constituency, you will have those who might necessarily be pro-life, might necessarily have some concerns, might have, in this case, come from a Catholic church, but still have to find some ways to sort of weasel out of it. So we'll get to that in just a minute. But my first article that I've posted here today, and let me again encourage you, if you're listening to this program, and we've just been broadcasting here at this particular time slot, a very new time slot, but we've been broadcasting on this program for 45 years. Marlon Maddox started back in 1972, and we are still going strong. But let me just mention that if you have not been going to our website, pointofview.net, we post a series of articles. And the first article here is by Shelby Steele. Now, if you're not familiar with Shelby Steele, very articulate individual. He's a senior fellow at the Hoover Institute at Stanford University, African-American, author of a book came out a couple of years ago called Shame, How America's Past Sins Have Polarized Our Country. And his latest piece that just has come out, which I'm starting to see people quote on Facebook. I haven't heard any talk show host quote it yet, so let us be the first. It's called The Exhaustion of American Liberalism. And the subtitle is White Guilt Gave Us Mock Politics Based on the Pretense of Moral Authority. Well, let me explain what he's saying. He said, there have been a whole flurry of marches and demonstrations and even riots. And, of course, we are a week from this coming Saturday having the student march for gun control. But nevertheless, Shelby Steele, being African-American, said this: unlike the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s, when protesters wore their Sunday best and carried themselves with heroic dignity, today's liberal marches are marked by incoherence and downright lunacy, hats designed to evoke sexual organs, poems that scream in anger yet have no point to make, and hysterical anti-Americanism. He says all of this suggests lostness, the end of something rather than the beginning. What is the ending? And he says that really America, since the 1960s, has lived through what might be called the age of white guilt. We still may be in this age, he says, but the Trump election suggests an exhaustion with the idea of white guilt and with the drama of culpability, innocence, and correctness in which it mires us. And really what he says is that white guilt is not actual guilt. It's really, in a sense, perhaps more of a fear. And a little bit later in the article, he says, white guilt is not angst over injustices suffered by others. It is the terror of being stigmatized with America's old bigotries, racism, sexism, homophobia, xenophobia. And to be stigmatized as a fellow traveler with any of these bigotries is to be utterly stripped of moral authority and made into a pariah. And he says, in some respects, this fits what the Bible calls the no name in the street. It pressures whites, he says, to act guiltily even when they feel no actual guilt. It's mock guilt, he says, a pretense of real guilt, a shallow etiquette of empathy, pity, and regret. And what he's talking about is something that we have discussed in other programs in the past, and that is the discussion today is not about trying to raise the moral conscience. The civil rights movement, for example, in the 1950s and especially in the 1960s, really tried to raise the moral conscience of America and say, you should be outraged by Jim Crow laws. You should be outraged by what is taking place in terms of segregation and racism, and Americans rightly were so. And the same kind of argument was made earlier by Mahatma Gandhi. That is, because we're dealing with the British in India, we can raise the question of whether or not their rule over us is legitimate. And if they were dealing with any other group of individuals that perhaps had no conscience, they would just simply mow them down in the streets. You can't imagine bringing up those same kind of moral objections in Pol Pot's Cambodia, in Stalin's Russia, certainly in Hitler's Germany. And yet, in some respects, this has worked fairly well until now. And the point he makes is that it doesn't seem to work very well, because when, for example, Donald Trump is referred to as racist, he just sort of rolls his eyes. And, of course, that brings us to another point that we've made on this program as well, and that is when you label everyone as a racist, sooner or later, nobody becomes a racist. The word doesn't mean anything anymore because it's thrown around constantly, and there is really no kind of ability to bring any kind of specificity to it. So, nevertheless, it's an article I wanted to post there today, and he says basically liberalism has evolved within a society shamed by its past, but the shame is weakened now. Like he said, when you have the president roll his eyes at being called a racist and no, he isn't one, then he says the jig is up. Bigotry exists, but it is far down the list of problems that minorities now face. He said, I grew up black in segregated America where it was hard to find an open door. It's harder now for young blacks to find a closed door. Fascinating article by Shelby Steele. When we come back, we're going to talk about this special election in Pennsylvania and how do Democrats make their peace with the issue of abortion. We'll be right back.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
You know, we're a divided nation in trying to decide what to do with immigrants who have come to this country illegally. That is why Congress has not passed legislation that will clarify the status of illegal aliens. That is also why we have a number of sanctuary cities and sanctuary states. I've always wondered how far liberal politicians would go to protect these immigrants. Now we know. Look at what happened in Oakland, California 2 weeks ago. The mayor warned the immigrant community that ICE agents would be conducting operations in the area. She further warned business owners that California was a sanctuary state and that it was therefore illegal for them to assist federal immigration authorities in any way. It turns out that ICE agents did conduct sweeps through the area. Of the suspected immigrants they caught, 150 had prior felonies or significant or multiple misdemeanors on their records. But they also estimated that more than 850 targets of the operation escaped because the mayor tipped them off. The mayor has been unapologetic and argues that it was her duty and moral obligation as mayor to give those families fair warning. She says it's a myth to believe that immigrants are dangerous criminals. Many are not dangerous, but what about those who have already committed felonies? Tony Brass is a former federal prosecutor who is concerned. He says her actions put agents in danger. You put the police in danger, and you put your neighbors in danger. Take the word immigrant out of the equation for a moment. Would you be concerned if the mayor of a city warned felons that a police raid was about to show up at their apartment or home? I hope so. That is why the actions by this mayor are so dangerous. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
From Irwin Brothers Entertainment, I Can Only Imagine. Rated PG in theaters March 16th. More information at ICanOnlyImagine.com.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Tomorrow, I think a lot of the nation will be looking at the Pennsylvania 8th District, and this is a particular district. It was held by Tim Murphy until he stepped down. If you go all the way back, Rick Santorum actually was from this district at one time. So you have this as a pretty solid Republican district, though it's moved around a little bit because of gerrymandering. So sometimes members of the district, some of the various citizens don't know which district they're in. But still, by and large, this is one that should be pretty straightforward. But I don't want to talk so much about that, although I suspect that we may be spending a fair amount of time talking about it on Wednesday, if indeed the Republican in that particular race does not win or does not win substantially. But I would like to focus for just a few minutes on the Democratic candidate, who seems like a very nice individual and very photogenic and probably is going to have some kind of success, if not in this congressional race, somewhere along the line. His name is Connor Lamb. But the piece that came out by Marjorie Dannenfelser, who's been on the program with us before, and also Robert Kania, is Connor Lamb go back to school on abortion. And the point is that they say that any reasonable person, Catholic or not, would acknowledge that being pro-life on the issue of abortion is kind of a non-negotiable teaching for members of the Catholic Church. Even so, yet another Catholic politician, they say, has made a Faustian bargain on abortion, and his recycled excuses haven't aged well. Now, again, that Faustian bargain is, you bargain against your soul, if you will, or you can look at different ways to try to say that. But nevertheless, Connor Lamb, who is the Democratic candidate in this 8th congressional district in Pennsylvania, said, "I just want to say I don't use the term pro-life to describe what I personally believe, because that's a political term. It's not one that you learn in Catholic school or anywhere else in church. Okay, well, this was kind of his response to a question about whether he would vote for a bill to ban late-term abortions after 5 months of pregnancy. Because, as we've talked about here as well, this is one where I don't care if you're pro-life or pro-choice, you have to say that this would be a really, I think, extreme position to say that after 5 months of pregnancy, we couldn't at least ban those very late-term abortions. After all, many states do that. And nevertheless, the authors of this particular article, including Marjorie Dannenfelser, who's been on the program with us before, said, terminology aside, is Lamb really suggesting that the Catholic Church is not pro-life or that it sees no use for pro-life laws? They say in either case, he ought to go back to Catholic school. And we know just the teachers to educate him on the responsibility of being a public servant faithful to the teachings of the church he claims to be a part of. And then they give a series of examples. And if you're Catholic, these will resonate with you. But even if you're not Catholic, it's just a reminder of how much, if you will, Catholic teaching in the 20th and 21st century, not to mention kind of the historic view, has always been there. So they first of all quote from one bishop in Springfield, Illinois, who recently issued a much-needed corrective to Illinois Senator Dick Durbin, telling him in no uncertain terms not to present himself for Holy Communion until he repents of his support for late-term abortions. Sadly, they point out in this article, Dick Durbin used to be pro-life and had to abandon those principles. You can go through a pretty long list, by the way, of individuals that over the years we've talked about here on Point of View that started out as pro-life individuals, and back when it was possible to be a pro-life Democrat, had no difficulty. But then if they wanted to run for national office, they wanted to run for the presidency or something like that, then many of them had to change because the catechism was, yeah, we can allow some pro-life Democrats in these congressional seats. Probably a little harder to allow a pro-life Democrat in a senatorial seat, but it's just impossible to even consider the possibility we would ever have a pro-life Democrat for president. And so, again, there is a good example of that. Dick Durbin at one time called himself and may have even been pro-life, but in order to be successful in the Democratic Party, that changes. The second example our authors use is Mother Teresa, who in 1994 at the National Prayer Breakfast spoke truth to those attending in Washington, D.C. about the war being waged against our smallest brothers and sisters, who she said were the greatest destroyer of love and peace is abortion. Another example they use is Pope John Paul II, who in his particular writings, The Gospel of Life, actually said that laws permitting the destruction of innocent human life are radically opposed to the common good. They cannot be excused with appeals to democratic freedom, and elected leaders, just like everyone else, he said, have a moral duty to stand against them. And then finally, the authors say that even this particular individual, Connor Lamb, could take a lesson from the current generation at his own school. And that's Central Catholic there in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, which sent an envoy of students and faculty to the Washington, D.C. This last year for the March for Life. And unlike Lamb, these students are not confused about the need to protect vulnerable unborn children and their mothers. So I thought it was pretty striking to see some of the examples they cited, from the bishop to Mother Teresa to the Pope to even students from a school where he matriculated. And they go on to say that based on his comments, Colin Lamb would also have failed biology and civics, because here he says, we believe that life begins at conception, he said, but as a matter of separation of church and state, goes on to say that I think a woman has a right to abortion. And so they go back and talk about the fact that in these particular cases, we're talking about a baby that has eyebrows, eyelashes, nails, and hair, a beating heart, can suck its thumb, can stretch, can make faces, and all of the rest. And they even point out that doctors perform astounding surgeries right in the womb using anesthesia as a standard procedure for unborn infants, after 20 weeks of gestation. Why? Because they feel pain. Premature infants born at this age increasingly have a fighting chance of surviving and thriving with proper care. And they go on to use an example. They said, just ask the family of Micah Pickering, who once was a sickly baby battling for life in intensive care and is now a healthy, happy little boy. Then they go on to say that one study showed that a 5-month-old unborn baby kicks with about 6.5 pounds of force. Those of you women out there that have had a baby, you know what we're talking about, those kicks that hit you in the stomach. And so, again, we're talking about something that is not just a piece of protoplasm or a so-called product of conception. We're talking about a baby here. But abortionists, they say, describe a different force, the force it takes to tear them apart in the womb with surgical implements. And in the words of one former Planned Parenthood medical doctor, oh, I have to hit the gym for this one, because the idea was how difficult it was to actually do. And sometimes the doctor explains the abortion doesn't kill them, and she has to worry about her staff and people's feelings if it comes out looking like a baby. So they conclude by saying, it's no wonder that only 7 nations in the world, including North Korea and China, 2 of the most notorious human rights violators, allow abortion on demand after 5 months of pregnancy. More than 2/3 of Americans want to get the United States out of this shameful minority of countries. And so that's why they talk about the fact that voter support for this legislation is especially high amongst millennials, 78%. We may talk about that on Wednesday with Nick Pitts and with some of the other roundtable participants. It's high among African Americans, 70% also support that. And even among Hispanics, 57%. And here's the interesting one. Even though he is trying to sort of hew to the Democratic leadership, Colin Lamb finds himself actually on the opposite side of Democrats, because even 51% of Democrats, a majority of Democrats, also support that kind of legislation. So abortions at 5 months and later have been barbarically cruel. Anyone who has difficulty drawing the line at this point is not a moderate, but an extremist, they say. And the Catholic Church teaching provides no cover for this kind of indefensible practice. So again, Lamb's position is not separation in church. It's separation, they say, of politician and spine. It's the maneuver of a man who dares not offend the Democratic Party, which is increasingly united in lockstep with the abortion lobby. And if he won't learn from giants of his own Catholic faith, from science and reason, or from the young survivors of America's abortion-on-demand regime, only a sound schooling by the voters will get through to him. So we'll see. Nevertheless, that is a case of, once again, an individual who probably, in his heart of hearts, is pro-life, but in order to run as a Democrat, has had to sublimate all of those feelings and pretend that the Catholic Church really doesn't say anything about it. If you'd like to join us, we're going to get into some other aspects of this discussion, but if you'd like to join the conversation, 1-800-351-1212. We'll be back right after this.
From Irwin Brothers Entertainment comes I Can Only Imagine. The untold true story of Mercy Me's Bart Millard and the power of redemption and forgiveness.
My dad was a monster, and I saw God transform him. I didn't think that God could do that.
I Can Only Imagine. Rated PG. Parental guidance suggested. In theaters March 16th. More information is available at ICanOnlyImagine.com.
When you listen to the news, do you ever feel like you're living on a different planet from those presenting the headlines? We've always known there was a subtle bias, but today, it's about as subtle as stepping off a 1,000-foot cliff. The only way to counteract that bias is with the truth. To join the Truth Team at Point of View, your support will educate and encourage potentially millions every day. Don't let lies win. Step up so that lives and our nation can be changed. Join the team at pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
I'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. While we're talking about the subject of abortion, I have another column, which we'll get to in just a minute, that I think also gets into this issue of abortion for undesirables, a real concern that I have. First article that we've posted on our website today, pointofview.net, exhaustion of American liberalism. Second one, Democratic Catholics and late-term abortion. And we'll get to the third one in just a minute on one of the comments that's come out with one of the Washington Post columnists, which caused Kimberly Ross to write about that. And so we're going to post that and get into it. Let me just mention, as you go to our website, you'll find a lot of great resources. Each day I do a daily commentary, which lasts about 2 minutes. The one today is about the mayor warning immigrants. And if you're not familiar with that, we have mentioned that previously. But again, people tune in and tune out. Maybe you're not aware of that. When I first talked about it about a week ago, even some of my panelists around the roundtable didn't know about it. So this is why sometimes I take an issue that I think is important and try to give you a little more background perspective. But it has to do with the fact that the mayor of Oakland, California, was desiring to warn the immigrant community that ICE agents would be conducting operations in the area. And first of all, I want to get to that issue about how that could have been really dangerous to some of those agents. But also, then she even warned the business owners that because California was a sanctuary state now, because of some of these laws passed out of Sacramento, that it was therefore illegal for them to even assist the federal immigration authorities in any way. And so what you had is the ICE agents did do a sweep. They picked out about, in my column, I talk about 150 that had felonies, about 200 and something that that were total. But of the ones that had felonies, a very sizable number had felonies or significant or multiple misdemeanors. And, of course, the mayor, after this was exposed, was unapologetic. First of all, about 850 got away, so those weren't even a part of the numbers there. But she said it's a myth to believe that immigrants are dangerous criminals. Well, it is a myth to believe that all of them are, but it's not a myth to believe that some of them are. And that is what is so concerning, that some are certainly dangerous, many are not. But it's not her role to sort those out. And the concern is that if indeed you are a gangbanger, you're a drug dealer, and you know ICE agents are coming, and you can't get out of town or you won't get out of town, and they come to your door, what do you think the ICE agents are going to be met with? Somebody says, okay, here are my hands, put your handcuffs on me. Or they're going to be met with, some kind of rifle or shotgun or pistol. You know what the answer to that is. And so in some respects, what she did was dangerous to the agents, probably dangerous to the neighborhood. But just take this as the way I deal with it in my commentary. If you take the word immigrant out of the equation, would you be concerned if a mayor of a city warned felons that a police raid was about to show up in their apartment or in their house? I think you would. And so, again, because this has the word immigrant on it, sometimes we're not using what I consider to be basic common sense. So that's my commentary today. If you'd like to sign up, my commentary comes out Monday through Friday. Benedexter, who joins us almost every Friday, her commentary that she does once a week comes out on Saturday. So 6 days a week, you get a commentary from us. If you'd like to sign up, it's free, and we certainly want to help you think through some of the issues taking place in our society. Well, let me get back to abortion for just a minute. We'll get on to a couple of other topics in the news today, and if we don't cover all of those in this hour, we will try to cover those maybe in the third hour. Let me just hasten to add that in just a few minutes, at 2 o'clock, we will have in studio with us O.S. Hawkins, and he is, of course, the president of Guidestone Financial Resources. We're going to be talking about his newest book, The Believer's Code, and we have, matter of fact, I have in front of me here, if you can see on the screen, the Joshua Code, the Jesus Code, the Daniel Code, the James Code. Each one of these have been so successful, and the profits from that go to support mission dignity, and so we'll talk more about that with him in just a moment. But let me get back to this issue of abortion for just a minute, because Kimberly Ross wrote about the fact that as technology progresses, rationalizing away the destruction of unborn becomes more complicated, because she says in the not-too-distant future past, in the not-too-distant past, she's first looking back, humans were in the dark about the gestational period. Life's beginnings were a complex mystery, and all the rest. But now medical advances shine much light on the beautiful and sacred time each new life spends in the womb. Each individual is a gift with characteristics set in stone from the time of conception. From that point on, they grow into who they were meant to be as their own unique DNA dictates. And then she goes on to say, last year it was reported that Iceland was on its way to eradicating Down syndrome from its society. She says, I suppose the term eradicate is much easier to digest than saying killing off anyone with the genetic disorder trisomy 21 while still in the womb. When we think of eradication, we think of something like smallpox, a deadly virus that was considered globally destroyed in 1980. We don't use the same terminology when discussing denying human life the chance to exist outside the womb. So Iceland and Down syndrome, it's just eradicating. And she says, thankfully, as a whole, the United States isn't too keen on killing off those disabilities just yet. But, of course, as we pointed out in Iceland, that is becoming so routine that they might eventually be able to eradicate Down syndrome, although I think it is still based upon a flawed assumption because any woman later on could come up with trisomy 21, but I won't get into the technical issues there. But what stimulated this particular commentary by her was that she was reading in the Washington Post Ruth Marcus, who's a self-described mother of two high-quality individuals, by the way, who are lucky enough to make it out of the womb, wrote about how she would definitely have aborted a baby with Down syndrome. And so here's actually what this woman, Ruth Marcus, said. She said, I have had two children. I was old enough when I became pregnant that made sense to do the testing for Down syndrome. I can say without hesitation that tragic as it would have been and it felt, and ghastly as a second trimester would have been, I would have terminated those pregnancies had the testing come back positive. I would have grieved the loss and moved on. And she says, if you believe that abortion is equivalent to murder, the taking of human life, then of course you would make a different choice. Yes, but this is not my belief, and the Supreme Court has affirmed my freedom to have that belief and act accordingly. And so what you can see, first of all, is, again, another fallback. As we talked about just a minute ago with this Democratic candidate running in Pennsylvania in the 18th district, his fallback position was, well, we don't really use the word pro-life in the Catholic Church. Yes, but they support pro-life principles, don't they? The fallback here is, well, if it's legal, then it's moral. Then you have Ruth Marcus going on in this commentary in the Washington Post to say, I'm going to be blunt here. That was not the child I wanted. That was not the choice I would have made. You can call me selfish or worse, but I am good company. The evidence is clear that most women confronted with the same unhappy alternative would make the same decision. And so, again, you can see some of the questions that are being raised in this particular commentary that we've posted by Kimberly Ross, because she says, who are we to determine what lives are worth living? Who are we to say that impaired function, mentally or physically, results in a life that means nothing? The real problem is this writer, Ruth Marcus, has with the thought of an imperfect child is not the infant itself, but her own lowered expectations. The idealization of motherhood, wherein one births and nurtures an exceptional being, often smacks head-on to reality. Life isn't a fairy tale. And she says that for those like Ms. Marcus, hardships must be avoided at all costs. If a defective child comes along, they must be eradicated. We should never love and raise one who falls short in our eyes even before birth. So ends the piece rather ironically by worrying about how far designer babies and eugenics might take us, all the while not including herself in the category of all of this. Because this individual that talks about how I would certainly have aborted a baby if indeed I knew that baby had Down syndrome, ends this commentary in the Washington Post this way. Technological advances in prenatal testing pose difficult moral choices about what, if any, genetic abnormality or defect justifies an abortion. Nearsightedness, being short, these are creepy eugenic aspects of the new technology that calls for vigorous public debate. But in the end, the Constitution mandates that these excruciating choices be left to individual women, not to government officials who believe they know best. So again, you can see, on the one hand, she would certainly want to make sure that a Down syndrome child could not come into her family. But on the other hand, at least in passing, worries about, will other women make choices based upon other things, nearsightedness, small, maybe not having the right gender, maybe not having musical or athletic ability. You can see that we all kind of are concerned about other people, but we never apply some of those moral principles to ourselves. Anyway, those are the columns we've posted today on our website, pointofview.net. Take the time to read them and pass them on to others. We'll be back with more right after this.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. In 1977, the Internal Revenue Service tried to declare that Catholic nuns operating in a hospital was not a, quote, religious function. Congress responded by amending the Employment Retirement Income Securities Act, or ERISA, to prevent the IRS from deciding what is or is not a church. Nonetheless, class action lawyers recently tried to argue that because some religious hospitals established pension plans, ERISA's exemptions did not apply because those plans were not established by a church. Well, a unanimous Supreme Court recently rejected that reasoning. The court recognized that Congress's amendment of ERISA continues to protect religious organizations from the burdens of ERISA, foreclosing the possibility that the IRS could bankrupt a religious organization simply because it does not believe the organization is religious enough. First Liberty Institute filed a friend of the court brief in this case on behalf of several religious organizations. As my colleague Justin Butterfield said of the decision in Advocate Healthcare Network versus Stapleton, quote, the history of the United States of America is one requiring the government to respect the religious freedom and autonomy of its houses of worship and religious organizations. The Supreme Court's decision respects that great history and tradition, allowing churches, synagogues, mosques, and religious ministries to pursue their religious mission without the weight of government bureaucracy and regulation hindering their efforts and intruding upon their mission. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
You can learn how to protect religious freedom in the workplace, public schools, your church, the military, and more by downloading First Liberty's free Religious Liberty Protection Kits at firstliberty.org. That's firstliberty.org. If you want hope for religious freedom, go to firstliberty.org.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes, and in the second hour today, we're going to have O.S. Hawkins in studio with us. Again, a man that has served in a number of pastorates, including First Baptist Church in Fort Lauderdale, and, of course, First Baptist Church in Dallas, Texas, and is the president of Guidestone Financial Resources, the author of all these wonderful books, the Joshua Code, the Jesus Code, the Daniel Code, the James Code. We're going to be talking today about the Believer's Code. Each one of these are great resources, and I think you might want to consider them them as gifts for Father's Day, for Mother's Day, for Easter. There are just all sorts of ways I think you could use these. And most importantly, as I have mentioned on so many different occasions, your support of those actually supports Mission Dignity, which is to help those individuals, these widows in particular, that have served in ministry but certainly do need financial support. And that's another great ministry that has come from this ministry that has been not only helping you with your finances, Guidestone, but also reaching out to those in the at least the Southern Baptist Convention. So we'll talk about some of that with O.S. Hawkins, and he has been over in the East Coast. I saw that he was preaching in church in Philadelphia, was also at the Rockefeller Foundation, and, of course, I noticed recently on one of his Instagram posts, I think, maybe, or Twitter, but I think it was Instagram, a picture of him with Billy Graham. Love to get some of his thoughts on that as well. Just before we wind it down today, not only are we looking at this election in the 8th District of Pennsylvania, but more importantly, the bigger issue, the one that I really haven't talked about today, but I should mention, is we're going to have these weekend protests from various youth. It's going to happen a week from Saturday, and this whole march that is taking place in Washington, D.C. and other places are going to be demanding gun control legislation. Now, as I've said in previous commentaries and even on this program here, that these young people have every right to express their views. But, of course, they're expressing their views in the public arena, so it means we also have a right to debate them, to discuss them, to correct what is being said. And there, as you might imagine, with a lot of youthful enthusiasm, are some things being said that are either inaccurate or maybe also inappropriate. Now, if you get USA Today, which I do, I was struck as I opened up the Friday edition of USA Today that Jonah Goldberg wrote about this and was concerned about the fact that we are maybe giving an uncritical platform to young people on the assumption that young people really have the moral authority to tell the rest of us what we need to do. And he said that in some respects we're kind of resurrecting an old American tradition of celebrating young people as inherently wiser and more moral than the adults. And he even goes on to say that this has been not just an American problem, it's been kind of an ancient confusion for a number of reasons. In the interest of time, let me focus on maybe one or two. The first is that we celebrate young people because they see the world with fresh eyes. And in some cases, that can be a plus because they're looking at the culture without necessarily focusing on some of the history and traditions. Because they're looking at things with fresh eyes, they can sort of cut through some of what Jonah Goldberg calls the fictions of modern life. If you want to put that in perspective, remember the story of the emperor's new clothes. Well, of course. We are talking about, of course, a child that did not understand that you were supposed to placate the king's vanity. And so as a result, you know, he was able to say the emperor's wearing no clothes. So there is some positive to that. But on the other side of it is that young people are not, as a group, wiser and better informed than older people. Now, you can cite all sorts of social studies, social service studies, psychological studies, you know, how even the brain forms, various kinds of surveys that have been done, and all the rest. But I love what Jonah Goldberg does. He just cuts through and says, here's a simple test in form of a question. Were you wiser and smarter when you were half your current age? Whatever your age is. Let's say you're 50. Were you smarter at 25 or are you smarter at 50? Let's say you're 30. Were you smarter at 15 than you were at 30? I don't think many of us are saying, oh, yeah. I don't think that's a question we're going to get an affirmative answer to. Wisdom comes with age, and intelligence comes with age. And so when teenagers that are 17 and 18 are telling us what we've done wrong, maybe we got to think through just a little bit whether or not they're maybe unaware of some of the nuances of some of those issues. And that, of course, brings us to another issue, and that is that many of these leaders have even gone on television and said the previous generation has screwed up. Now, he didn't use the word with an S. It had a different letter behind it and really was pretty offensive. But again, what is very typical is to blame the current problems on the previous generation. And again, they're free to do so. but they ignore many of the blessings that they are enjoying. The fact that they have free speech, the fact that they have such a healthy environment in which they live. And let me quote somebody that would certainly endorse this idea that we live in such a golden age, and that is former President Barack Obama. He said, if you had to choose a moment in time to be born, any time in human history, and you didn't know ahead of time what your nationality you were, or what gender or your economic status might be, you'd choose today. We are the beneficiaries of great medical technology. We're the beneficiaries of living in a world where there is greater freedom and opportunity than ever before. And so just, is one of those admonitions maybe to these young people that when they take the podiums in about a week to criticize politicians, to criticize corporations, to criticize all sorts of different groups and the previous generation, they might want to at least express some gratitude for the freedom and opportunities that, frankly, are available to each one of them. So just a couple of thoughts about what is going to transpire over the next couple of weeks, and especially culminate a week from Saturday. Again, we'll be looking at the Pennsylvania 18th District. As I pointed out before, this was a district held by Tim Murphy until he stepped down. And then, of course, this is one that has actually been even the original House district of Rick Santorum. So it'll be interesting to see what happens here. Rick Saccone is the Republican. I didn't mention his name before, an Air Force veteran, has represented the Pittsburgh suburbs in the state house since 2012. He's running proudly as Trump 2.0. So that is going to be interesting because if indeed he loses or does not win by a significant percentage, then you know what the headlines will look like certainly in the next couple of weeks and certainly on Wednesday morning. So we'll see what has happened here. And so this is what will be a topic of conversation, perhaps tomorrow, certainly on Wednesday. And in the old days, it used to be that a special election was not significant. How things have changed. We remember the special election for a U.S. Senator in Alabama, all the things we talked about. Here, a special election in Pennsylvania might be either a bellwether vote and give us a watershed that goes one direction or a watershed that goes another. So we'll see how it plays itself out, and we'll be watching that course tomorrow and especially Wednesday. All through the week, by the way, I might just mention that we have all sorts of great guests. In just a few minutes, we're going to have O.S. Hawkins in studio with us. Tomorrow we have Joel Rosenberg in studio with us. And, of course, we have our Millennial Roundtable. We'll have, of course, our Friday weekend edition, which will have Penny Dexter and Debbie Georgiada. So just a lot of things to cover this week. And if you'd like some more information about either my commentary today or some of the articles we posted, all available at the website pointofview.net. And if you appreciate the conversation we have here, let me encourage you to, as you go to that website, click on that button that says donate. Even a small gift would be greatly appreciated. It'd be your way of saying, I've been listening to the program. I appreciate what you have to say, and I want to hear more of it. Let's take a break. O.S. Hawkins will be in studio with us. All that coming up right after these important messages.
Why should you become a partner with Point of View Radio? Because for decades, this team has made a significant difference in lives and communities across the nation. Because America is dying for lack of biblical wisdom about life and culture. You should give because your gift will make possible cutting-edge information on issues that matter, information you won't hear anywhere else. Why? Because your gift will change lives, because you'll influence our culture with biblical truth, and because you can make a difference for the future. Our nation needs a truth team very badly. Support Point of View Radio today at pointofview.net. Click on Join the Truth Team and choose your level of support. Pointofview.net. Or call 800-347-5151. 800-347-5151. Or mail that first donation to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Box 30, Dallas 75221. Point of View will continue after this.